Okay, I wanted to show you how to install Linux uh, into a virtual machine. I'm going to demonstrate using the VirtualBox virtual machine, which is available for free. There are other virtual machine applications available. VMware is a well-known one, and actually I think there's a Hyper-V system that is available for Windows 10. So the first thing you need to do is actually go to the virtualbox.org website, go to the download section, and then download the VirtualBox program. So a little bit of terminology first. Um, you're going to be dealing with two operating systems. There's the operating system that's currently running on your PC, and that's known as the host operating system, and that's where you'll be running the VirtualBox application or program. And then inside that virtual machine you'll be installing another operating system that's known as the guest operating system. So in this demonstration I'm going to be running VirtualBox on a Windows host. Download the version of VirtualBox for Windows Host. Optionally, there is an extension pack for VirtualBox that you can download as well. This is not required. As I said, it's optional. It enables some additional features within the VirtualBox program. So download and install VirtualBox. That's fairly straightforward. Optionally download the extension pack. And then next you'll need to download some installation media for your guest operating system. There are several different versions of Linux available. Ubuntu is a very common and well-known distribution. It's what's running in CS Lab. I'm going to demonstrate actually instead using a variant of Ubuntu called lubuntu. So lubuntu is a lightweight distribution, so it runs very quickly even inside a virtual machine. You probably have no trouble running Ubuntu in a virtual machine if you've got a relatively new computer, but Lubuntu is typically going to run a little faster. Actually, Lubuntu uses as its desktop environment the LXDE desktop environment and applications. That's a desktop environment that focuses, as it says here, on speed and energy efficiency. That's also the same desktop environment that we installed under Sigwin in that set of videos. So download the latest version of Ubuntu. I downloaded the 64-bit version of Ubuntu. It's actually possible to run the 64-bit version of Ubuntu inside a virtual machine that's running on a 32-bit host. That's not generally recommended. If you have a 32-bit host operating system, I'd recommend that you download the 32-bit version of Ubuntu instead. But I've got a 64-bit host, and so I'm going to use the 64-bit version of Ubuntu. So I've downloaded that already to my downloads directory here under Windows. You can see that it's over a gigabyte in size. Now if you were installing on a physical machine, you would typically burn this image. This is a DVD image file or an ISO image file. You would burn this to a DVD. It's not necessary to do that when you're installing Lubuntu or actually any version of Unix or any other operating system inside a virtual machine. So then know where you've downloaded that ISO image, and then start up the VirtualBox manager. It should look like this. And what we want to do is create a new virtual machine. And you see that it's set up for default here, that assuming that you've got a guest operating system, a Windows guest operating system. I'm going to call my virtual machine Lubuntu, and it's magically figured out that this is actually a version of Linux, and that I'm going to install the 64-bit version. I'm going to call this Lubuntu 18.04, which is at the time of this video, it's the latest release of Ubuntu. Actually, you may, when you start up the VirtualBox Manager, you may see a screen like this. Again, just type in the name of the machine that you want to use for the machine. This can actually be anything. You can create several different virtual machines, different versions of Lubuntu, or create one for Lubuntu and Ubuntu. You might have a DOS virtual machine or a Windows virtual machine, or even a free BSD virtual machines. So then click on Next. I'm going to use the recommended amount of memory here, which is 1 gigabyte that's going to be allocated to the virtual machine. That's sufficient for Lubuntu, so I'll leave that as recommended. And then now we have to actually create a hard disk for our virtual machine. This virtual hard disk will actually contain the Linux operating system, the Ubuntu operating system, and all the applications. Now on the host machine, this will exist as a file. So I need to create a virtual hard disk when I create a new virtual machine, so the default option is here. And then there are a choice of different hard disk file types. I recommend just using the default, the VDI hard disk image. The VirtualBox supports other formats, but we'll leave it set at VDI. Then you have the option here of allocating the hard drive image file all at once initially. That's called a fixed size hard disk file. It says here it's maybe a little faster to use, or a dynamically allocated hard disk file. So this is a file that's on the host operating system, that as we add applications into the virtual drive, that host file will actually grow as needed up to this limit that we'll set in the next window. So I'm going to leave the default dynamically allocated. It recommends, VirtualBox recommends a 10 gigabyte hard drive. I'm actually going to increase that a little bit to 25 gigabytes. Again, it's not as much of a concern, the value here that I use, especially since I'm using a dynamically allocated file. It'll start out as small, based on the software we select during the installation, and then grow as needed. So it's not going to take up this much space on my host machine. So create, and then now I've got my virtual machine created. It's an empty virtual machine. I've essentially just got a hard drive. You can click on the settings here. You can go in and change at this point the allocated memory, the number of CPUs, some issues about the storage. You'll see under the storage category that I've got 2 disk controllers, a serial ATA, and of course this is emulated, a serial controller that's connected to my virtual hard drive. The virtual hard drive actually exists in a file on the host system. That's Lubuntu 18.04.vdi. And then I've got another disk controller that's a disk controller for an optical drive, and I don't have an optical drive created. What I'm going to do is link my optical drive to that disk image file that I downloaded. So it's empty here, so I come over here to the right on this DVD icon. I'm going to choose a virtual optical disk, and then navigate to my downloads directory and click on the Lubuntu download. And then one other thing that I want to check here is actually in the system motherboard. There's several different devices that I can boot off of, boot my virtual machine off of. The boot order here is selected as floppy. I actually don't have a floppy drive created for my virtual machine, but if it can't find a floppy, it'll then try to boot off of my optical drive, which is what I want my virtual machine here to do initially. I want it to boot off of that Lubuntu DVD that I downloaded. So click OK, and then so now I've got my installation DVD connected to my machine, so I can just click Start. And it popped up on the other display. So let me drag it over here. I can select a language to use during installation. I'm going to select English, and then I get several options here. I can try Lubuntu without actually installing it, run it directly off the DVD, but I want to actually install it on my virtual machine, so I go to the second option, Install Lubuntu. Have to wait here a few seconds now as it actually will boot up a version of Linux that's used during the installation procedure. So wait for the next window to pop up. Here we go. It looks like it's going to work. I get a graphical display at this point with the selection screen. Let me mention at this point, in some installations, the graphics screen here, it comes up garbled or distorted where you can't see anything. One trick that may help if that happens is Linux supports what's known as multiple virtual terminals. You can what may help if the graphics is garbled and you can't see the display is switch to a text-based virtual terminal and then switch back to this graphical terminal. So to do that, press Control-Alt and then press F4. That will switch to a text-based terminal. And then I'll switch back to my graphical terminal just by pressing Alt F1. So that may clear up any graphic issues that you're having. Okay, I want to install the English version of Lubuntu, so I'll continue. I've got an English language keyboard, so continue. Most of the installation you're just going to click through. I'm going to do a normal installation, so web browser utilities, office software, games, media players, and then click this option where it's also going to download some updates while installing Lubuntu. I can apply these updates afterwards, but it saves a little time if you allow the system to go ahead and download some updates while we're doing the installation, and then click on continue again. And then I get to this window where it's saying that there's no operating system installed. What do I want to do? This sounds pretty dangerous. Erase disk and install Ubuntu. Now that would be maybe risky if you're installing to a physical machine, but I'm installing to a virtual machine. So the disk it's talking about here is my virtual disk, which actually I just created. It's that 25 gigabyte disk that I created earlier. So there is actually nothing on it. So I can ignore this warning about deleting all your programs and stuff in all operating systems on that disk because there's nothing on it. Now if I'm installing to a physical PC where I've already got another operating system installed, say Windows, I probably don't want to take this option. I want to do something else, set the machine up so that I can dual boot both Windows and Linux. So I'm not going to talk any more about that now, but again, I'm cautioning against actually at this point installing Lubuntu on a physical machine. If you have some questions about how to do that, please come and see me and I can walk you through that. So, but just install now, and then it gives me one final chance. It's already partitioned that drive, and now it's going to format it with a file system, the 4th extended file system. and then click continue. And then now I have to pick the particular time zone. I can try and find Evansville on here, and probably Chicago would be fine. I think it may actually find Evansville if I type it in, give it a little time for comma IN. There we go. It's at the top of the menu now. And then continue. And then here's where I set up my user account. So I type in my name, and then it selects a username based on my full name. You can change this to be something else if you want it to be, if you want to have a different username. So here's just by default it's just chosen a lowercase version of my first name, and then it's also given the computer name. I'll just leave this at this point. You know, if you've got you could change this if you want. Well, actually, let's go ahead and call this lubuntu. You can actually create a virtual network of machines, and in that case you'd want each computer on your virtual network to have a different name. And then choose a password. So again, recommend choosing somewhat secure password. Mine's rated as fair. You have if you want to, you can set it so it logs in automatically. Then when this boots, it'll automatically log you into this chosen username. I'm not going to check that. I'll deal with the login screen. And then continue. And then now, actually, I think it's been copying files in the background while I was going through that. So it was copying files off of the DVD. You may see it actually start to copy files, update files off the internet here. While it's going through this installation, you can click through and read about some of the features of Lubuntu. Again, it's based on the LXDE desktop. It talks about the available web browser. Firefox is installed by default, but you can install other browsers. Chrome is a common one. It's software for creating and editing documents. It installs Abbey Word and Numeric as the default spreadsheet software, and Abbey Word is the default document editing software. I typically install LibreOffice as well. So in another video I'll show you how to install additional software within Lubuntu. Let's see, software for actually listening to music installed is Audacious, and then for watching DVDs or other videos, GNOME MPV is installed by default. I typically install VLC, the Virtual LAN console, and then chat software, which I don't use. And then it talks a little bit about how you can install other software, and there's a couple different ways to do this. And then accessing help on the user community, and finally a thank you. So looks like it's perhaps almost done. So I was thinking about closing the video and continuing later, but I think maybe I'll just, if you're patient, I've got a reasonably new machine, host machine here, and with an i5 processor, so it's kind of quick. So I'm hoping I'll get the installation will only take a few more minutes. Looks like it's going to be a little longer than planned, so I won't bore you here. I'm going to just stop the video, and then I'll continue after the setup is complete.